And hello to all of you watching today. We are delighted that you've joined us today to gain some new, hopefully, information, improve your or increase your awareness about eating disorders and what we can do to help someone who's caught up in an eating disorder. The topic that I would like to cover today is breaking the ties that bind, intervening on a loved one in the grips of an eating disorder. You know, over the last 10 years or so, the concept of intervention has become much more popular and reaching a much wider audience, in large part due to television shows and social media that present what that's all about. And we're very grateful that the message has reached a wider audience, a larger audience, that this is available to assist families with a loved one that they're concerned about. Unfortunately, there's been some real downsides as well. There's a lot of misconceptions about intervention. A lot of people think, well, some guy just shows up one day and a few family members read a couple of letters and the person goes to treatment, or the person runs out of the room and everyone chases them down the street. Well, that's not an accurate representation of what we do. Trained and credentialed intervention professionals have a lot of education, a lot of expertise, and a lot of experience in this field, and it is not something to be treated lightly. So I'd like to share with you today some thoughts about intervention. In fact, I'd like to cover with you the four primary models of intervention that are currently being practiced in the United States, as well as a model that I've developed that I believe incorporates the best aspects of each of these. We absolutely believe that intervention is a first step to recovery from eating disorders. And intervention is not therapy. It is about breaking that cycle and helping someone make a choice to receive help. We believe in guiding the family with compassion. It's never about judgment and criticism. We believe in managing the circumstances through experience. And also, we believe in helping the individual reach out for recovery. It's their choice. But the rest of the family can make choices as well, and we'll get into that in more detail. There are a lot of myths about eating disorders, and I won't read all of these, but one of them in particular that I'd like to talk about is right in the middle there. Your loved one must hit bottom in order to accept help. I understand the power and the value of hitting bottom. What I don't like is when a dirty four-letter word is introduced to the equation, and that word is spelled W-A-I-T. We must wait for them to hit bottom. Well, now hold on. If we have a loved one that's truly in the grips of this disease or disorder, and it is evident that this has the potential to be lethal or fatal, what are we waiting for? An intervention steps in to bring the bottom up to hit the individual rather than waiting for the individual to hit bottom. Either way, a bottom is reached, and we encourage and assist that individual in reaching out for help. The truth is, eating disorders are chronic, progressive, and fatal diseases left unchecked. And of course, there are diseases of denial. That's just at the very core of ED. ED wants the victim to believe that they don't have it. You know, we often say that these diseases are the only diseases on earth that tell their victims they don't have it. And intervention is a starting point for change. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about what we believe eating disorders are all about. We believe they are bio, psycho, social, spiritual diseases or disorders. If you're uncomfortable with the word disease, use the word disorder. I'm okay with either. What matters to me is giving that individual some help. At the biological level, the disease or disorder is primarily neurological. Now, of course, there's a lot of physiological damage going on, but the actual disease process, the disorder, is neurological, and that's got to be addressed in treatment. Then there's the psychological aspect, all the bizarre behaviors that accompany an eating disorder. There's the social side. Often people in the grips of these diseases withdraw, isolate, and pull away from the most meaningful people in their lives, and they begin to associate with other people who do the same thing they do. And of course, there's the spiritual aspect. I'm not referring to religion per se. I'm talking about the mind-body connection. I'm talking about who we are on the inside, our values, our morals, and so forth. All of that gets impacted So eating disorders are not like a head cold. Give it a couple of weeks and it'll run its course. It's not like a broken bone. Put a cast on it and in 6 weeks it's good as new. These diseases are monsters, and they attach themselves to a person at all of these levels, and all of these levels need to be looked at. But primarily, the point I want to make is this is why sitting your loved one down or a loved one down and wanting to have a rational, reasonable, logical conversation about the disorder very often is ineffective. Why? Well, that individual is in the grips of an illogical, unreasonable, irrational disease or disorder. It does take a different approach. So as I mentioned, there are different intervention protocols currently being practiced throughout the country, and I'd like to introduce you to 4 of them. The first is called ARISE. That's an acronym for a Relational Intervention Sequence for Engagement. The second there you'll see is the Family Systems, which is an educational seminar. Both of these approaches are invitational. In other words, there's no surprise. From the very beginning, the affected individual is invited to be part of the process. There are a couple of other models that are non-invitational. The Nouthetic model, which is biblical and confrontational, and the Johnson Institute model, which is the model that most people are familiar with. This is the model where the individual is asked to come to a meeting, they're unaware of what they're walking into, and the family is together to share their love, care, and concern. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on all 4 of these models, and then talk about that model that I've developed, which I believe takes advantage of the best of each of these models. The ARISE system, as I mentioned, is invitational, and it typically happens in 3 stages. And it is based on these 7 primary assumptions. And I'll let you read through those on your own. But what's most important, I believe, is point number 4. The practitioners of the ARISE model believe that families are more powerful than treaters in effecting change due to the inherent dynamics within the family system. Stage 1 is that first call. This is where someone contacts the interventionist and says, we've got a problem. Our loved one needs help and is refusing that help. What do we do? And so that person is referred to as the CO, or the concerned other. The interventionist guides that caller into some processes and steps that they're about to take and asks them to reach out to the most important people in their loved one's life to create what is referred to as the intervention network. And an initial meeting is scheduled with that intervention network. And very importantly, under this model, the identified patient, the individual caught up in the disease, is invited to attend that very first meeting. So there's no surprise. Stage 2 is a series of intervention network meetings. Motivational strategies are developed. There may be as many as 5 of these meetings, and each time the identified patient, the afflicted individual, is invited to attend, and the team is talking about treatment. That's the whole purpose of these meetings. So there may be as many as 5 of these meetings. If by the end of these meetings, the identified patient has not accepted the offer for help, then a formal Johnson Institute model is facilitated. The IP has been given a number of opportunities to engage in treatment, and so the team then steps in to present their choices regarding this individual's decision not to seek help. If you'd like to learn more about the ARISE model, I encourage you to read the book Invitational Intervention, a step-by-step guide for clinicians by Drs. Judith Landau and James Gareth. Dr. Landau is a personal friend, and I think the world of her. You'll get a lot out of reading her materials. Next is the family systems model. Again, it's invitational. The identified patient and the family are invited to be part of this from the very outside. The difference is this is an educational model, often carried out over a 2-day period. The entire family is brought together, including the identified patient, and a lot of teaching and training about the disease or disorder they're dealing with, whether it's eating disorder or a chemical issue or compulsive gambling or compulsive sexual behavior. A lot of education is presented always with a goal towards encouraging that individual to accept some ongoing help. According to the Family Systems model, there are 6 steps towards family healing. And again, I won't review them all, but I'll touch on a couple of them. The interventionist or the counselor discusses different types of treatment for the family and the individual. That may be a recommendation for inpatient treatment. It may be a recommendation for an outpatient setting or one-on-one therapy with a counselor, a registered dietitian, whoever may be. Typically, a 6-month to 1-year treatment plan is created during the seminar and then implemented. So again, the individual is invited to be part of the process, but it's much more educational in its format. Let's move on then to the 2 non-invitational models. The first being nouthetic. Now that may be a word you've never heard before. It's based on the Greek word nouthesis, which is about confronting in love, speaking the truth in love. In fact, there's actually a model of this that you can find in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 18, if you're inclined to read that. Contemporary proponents, of this model would be Jay Adams. You could read his book, The Christian Counselor's Manual or Competent to Counsel. Typically, these are trained pastoral counselors. It is a moral approach, but it is one that's based on confront with love, not judgment. Then there's the model that most of us are familiar with, the Johnson Institute model, as developed by Dr. Vernon Johnson in the late 60s. His classic book, Intervention, a step-by-step guide for families of friends of chemically dependent persons, is a must-read for anyone really wanting to understand the field of intervention. And even though the book was primarily written around chemical dependency, the protocol, the steps, are just as applicable when dealing with an individual caught in the grips of an eating disorder. As mentioned, it is non-invitational and it is confrontational. It's process-oriented. It's designed by its very nature to break through the denial of that individual. And again, touches on that fallacy of hitting bottom. This model is based on 5 key principles: that meaningful persons that are brought together, that all of these people write down very specific data about the impact that their loved one's behavior has had on them. They tell that person how they're feeling. It's not about judging them. It's about sharing, here's how I feel based on what I've seen. The addicted individual or the afflicted individual is offered very specific choices. The choice for this treatment center or that hospital, not a menu of choices, but a very specific choice. When the individual agrees to accept help, it's made viable right now. In other words, we don't then say, okay, someday we might talk about treatment. That's been prepared in advance so that the family now says, okay, get in the car, it's time to go. Here are the key steps of the Johnson Institute model. And we've really kind of gone over these already. So let's move on. I'd like to talk to you about an approach that I refer to as the Trans-Theoretical Intervention Protocol, or TIP. It's Johnson Institute based in that it is non-invitational. However, it does incorporate the trans-theoretical model of intentional behavior change as developed by Prochaska, DiClemente, and Norcross. Sometimes this is called the stages of change. This model recognizes not only the needs of the afflicted individual, but also the family. And it's designed to accelerate the changes necessary to move the whole family forward into recovery. Now again, the trans-theoretical model was developed by James Prochaska, Carlo DiClemente, and John Norcross. And one of the classic books that they've written is Change for Good. Another one is Addiction and Change, How Addictions Develop and Addicted People Recover. Be a great resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about the stages of change. The stages of change, or the trans-theoretical model, is based on 4 dimensions: stages of change, processes of change, markers of change, and context of change. So in this particular model of intervention, all 4 of these dimensions are taken into account and incorporated. However, on a very rapid pace. Often stages of change in counseling is a lengthy process. In the intervention model, it happens pretty quickly. Many of you are familiar with the stages of change, but if you're not, here they are. Pre-contemplation, that's the stage I'm in when I'm stuck. I'm not even thinking about change. Contemplation, well, I'm thinking about it. I'm not doing anything about it. I'm just thinking about it. Then there's preparation. That's the planning stage. I'm developing a plan for change and what that might look like. Then there's action. Okay, I'm working the plan. This is the stage that usually is the most rewarding, in that people pat us on the back and say, "Attaboy, you're doing good." Then there's what I believe to be the most difficult stage, which is maintenance. I've made the change. Now I've got to maintain that change. Now I've got to take the steps to stay in recovery. There's another stage called termination, and I don't believe we reach that in all cases. Some changes can become so permanent and long-lasting, we don't really have to take very many steps to maintain it. In other cases, recovery is an ongoing maintenance process where people attend recovery support group meetings, they work with other individuals, they might have a sponsor. They're actively involved in an ongoing recovery program, so they live the rest of their life perhaps in maintenance, and there's nothing wrong with that. In this model, here's some of the goals. I have an initial assessment or consultation. Family might call me, or someone might reach out to me. First thing I need to do is determine, is an intervention clinically appropriate? I have had some people contact me that, quite frankly, what they would like me to do is come to their house, put handcuffs on their loved one, and drag them off. That's called a kidnap. That's not an intervention. So we do need to determine, is an intervention clinically appropriate? Is this individual really able to understand what we're saying, or are they so cognitively impaired or caught up in psychosis to where they really can't understand what we're talking about? That would not be appropriate. So in this initial consultation, answer a lot of questions. Questions about eating disorders, questions about the compulsive behaviors that go along with those eating disorders, and a lot of questions about the intervention process. What does it look like? If this family is not already talking with a treatment program, it's my responsibility then to make them aware and provide information on some programs that might be appropriate for their loved one. Once we're ready to go, we have an initial team meeting. This is where I pull together the intervention team, and the criteria that I ask for is people that your loved one either loves or admires or wouldn't want to disappoint. These are people that the loved one cares about and would have influence in their lives. It's often immediate family, but it can also be friends. It can be co-workers. It can be a coach from school. People who have influence in that individual's life. I need to understand the stage of change that each of the team members is in. As you might imagine, I pulled together a room of 8 people, and I've got 2 people in the action stage. They're ready to move. And I've got 2 people in the pre-contemplation stage. They don't even understand what we're talking about. And then I've got 4 people in various stages in between. So I need to identify what stage of change the team members are in. I need to recognize the markers for change and the context of change, again, for the team members. I'm not going to go into significant detail on those. You can read more about those in the books that I mentioned. But I do need to spend a lengthy period of time training the team members on what I want them to write down that they will read to their loved one when we meet with that person. Here's an example of some of the documents that I use. I need to understand a full picture of what's going on. Is this person involved in one of these, multiple levels of these, and is the afflicted loved one in pre-contemplation or preparation or action? Where is that person on each of these. It's not unusual, frankly, to intervene on someone who's been in long-term recovery from alcohol abuse and now they have an eating disorder. So coming at them as though the alcohol needs to be addressed isn't the issue, it's the eating disorder. So I need to understand what's going on, and the team members are the ones that can provide me with that data. Moving on. I need to do an evaluation of each team member. So I will jot down their name, I'll jot down their relationship to the individual or the identified patient. I want to know who's who, and I'm going to ask them for their awareness of what's going on. In some cases, people have intimate awareness of the details. In other cases, well, it's more secondhand. Well, here's what I've heard. That doesn't rule them out as being a team member if they've got influence and impact in that individual's life. But I need to really understand this team, and that's where those stages of change are really, really critical. Now, once everyone has gathered, I'm going to train them on a letter that I want them to write to their loved one. And as you can see here, it's a three-part letter. Section 1 is affirmation of love. I encourage them to use specific instances. Hey, remember that time that we were together and we had all this fun and how much we cared about each other? Very specific instances to affirm them. Secondly, they need to present their reality. This is about, I'm concerned. Here's what I'm seeing, and about that I feel. Here's what I heard, and here's what I feel about that. And then finally, section 3, that's the tough one. It's the consequences, not punishment. Consequences for choosing against engagement in treatment. The natural consequences of the identified patient's choices. Intervention is about choices and consequences. It is not about coercion. It is not about judgment and condemnation. It is about choices and consequences. If you've been around someone caught up in an eating disorder, you've probably noticed that frequently they want to make choices and let everyone else live with the consequences. Well, that's part of what has to change. We have to be able to say to our loved one, I love you enough to give you the consequences of your choices. So that letter is very, very critical. Once that is complete, we're ready to do a rehearsal. We're going to rehearse the intervention just as though the loved one was there. We will rehearse that person's entrance. We will rehearse seating arrangements. I mean, we really drill down to the nitty-gritty. I want to hear the letters that everyone has written. I might make requests for some modifications. I might ask them to delete certain words, to add certain words. We want to avoid judgment, and we want to put in there the team members' feelings. We want to rehearse potential objections that this person may bring up. When I put the offer on the table to go to treatment and they say yes, great, it's time to go. If they say no, I'm going to ask the most important two-letter question of the day, or two-word question of the day. And that question is, why not? I want to hear that. I want to know why not, so that we can deal with those objections, not argue, not fight. This is not an argument. This is not about a fight. This is about choices and consequences. So our goal is to negate those objections. Okay, that's taken care of. That's not a problem. Let's go. Let's accept some help. We talk a lot about logistics, seating arrangements in the room, which order the letters will be read, handling a runner. One of the biggest fears families have is when their loved one walks in and sees everyone, they'll run. It does happen, but very, very seldom. And so we need to be prepared for that and discuss how we will respond, not react, but respond. And then we need to talk about transportation to the treatment facility. Make sure all of those logistics are covered before we even get to the time that we're meeting with the individual. All right, now as I mentioned, the letters are read at the rehearsal, and one of the important things about that is team building. Quite often, as these letters are read, team members who may have been a little bit leery about this process, they get on board and they can fully understand what's going on. It also gives me, the interventionist, the opportunity to make some judgments. It doesn't happen often, but there have been some times after hearing a person's letter, I had to exclude them from the process. They're just too angry. And that's not what this is about. So I actually have a form that as I listen to them read their letters, where I jot down some thoughts or ideas from each section, and I may come back to them and say, well, let's use this word in section 1, or let's expand that story a little bit in section 2. So I coach them a lot. Ultimately, this is about the family members sharing with their loved one the impact the eating disorder has had on them. And so I often have to coach people on how to use feeling words. You know, when you say you're sad, what does that mean? When you say you're ashamed, what does that mean? So I provide them a handout that helps them use the kinds of words that they need to use to be able to express what's going on inside of them to their loved one. I mentioned we identify potential objections to treatment. I literally write these down. I want to hear from the family member. How might your loved one say, or what might their objections be if they say no? We want to rehearse and be ready how we're going to overcome those. In some cases, I'm going to speak to the objection. In other cases, it may require a family member to step in. If the reason they're not willing to go to treatment is who will take care of the dog, well, I can't, but a family member can. So depending on what those objections might be, we rehearse and we prepare for how to respond to them. Again, at the rehearsal, there's some more logistics that we need to cover. We've already gone over some of that. Now it's time for the actual intervention. Once we are ready, now it's time to invite the loved one into the process. So I'm going to have the team members read sections 1 and 2 only of their letter, each person. I'm going to ask the loved one to sit down and allow each person to share their hearts, and they're going to read, and I mean read, not talk off the top of their head, read sections 1 and 2 of the letter. At that point, I'm going to put the offer for treatment on the table. Whatever the family has decided they'll support, whether that's residential treatment or outpatient treatment, this is what your family will support. And I'll give some information about that treatment program if needed, answer questions the individual may have. And again, I'm going to ask that important 2-word questions if they say no. And we're going to move into overcoming those objections. And throughout that, I continue to put the offer on the table. Well, that's not an issue. Are you ready to go? Well, we've taken care of that. Are you ready to go? But again, ladies and gentlemen, this is ultimately that person's choice. And if they make a choice not to accept help, then they need to understand the choices their family is making and the new boundaries they're going to put in place, the changes they're going to have to make in the relationship in order to support wellness and recovery. It is about sending this message to the loved one. We love you, and we will support wellness and recovery. And right now, that means you engage in this program. And we will support you in any way that we can on an ongoing basis for recovery. And, here's the tough one, and we won't support anything else. So the individual needs to understand that their choice does have consequences. So we talked about overcoming objections. The one thing I want to point out here is we're going to avoid fighting. This is not about a fight. This is not about who has the loudest voice. This is about choices and consequences. And even if the afflicted individual wants to fight, we're not going to go there. We are not going to fight with this individual. We're going to present the truth. Now, when the individual chooses treatment, here's what needs to take place. Primarily, it's transportation to the treatment facility. A bag has been packed in advance. The treatment facility is on board. The person has been approved for admission. Now it's time to go. So this may be an automobile ride, maybe a plane ride. We need to make sure that the right persons are there. In fact, I insist that a family member accompanies their loved one all the way to the treatment center. Now, I may go, I may not. It depends on the circumstances. But I insist on a family member who is present at the intervention to accompany their loved one all the way through to the treatment program. And those individuals need to be coached. So I will have spent quite a bit of time with the family members who are accompanying their loved one, coaching them on what do you do during this trip. It's about being their cheerleader. It's about being their support. It's not about criticism and judgment. It's not about threats. So I spend a lot of time coaching the family members who will accompany. But what if they say no? Ultimately and finally, they dig their heels in and say, absolutely not. Well, then it's time for them to hear section 3 of their letters. The part that says, well, since you've made that choice, here are my choices. And each time I'm coming back to the individual saying, is that really the life you want to have with your family? Or are you ready to go to treatment? But ultimately, I'm going to respect their choice. And if they refuse to go, then okay. When they choose treatment, my work with the family is not over. While their loved one is in treatment, I continue to support the family through coaching, through guidance, helping them understand what's going on in treatment. If I can get on the release at the treatment center, I can get regular updates from that team on how their loved one is doing, and I can provide that ongoing service to the family. But I also have an obligation to the family when their loved one chooses not to go to treatment. I want to help them process through their feelings. I don't just leave. Now it's time to sit down with the family after the loved one has said no and left and do some coaching, some guidance, and support for the family. This team's got to remain united. Statistics show us that over 80% of the time, the individual chooses treatment the day of the intervention. Of the 20% that don't, well over half will go to treatment in a relatively short period of time, providing the family stays united in the consequences and boundaries they put in place at the intervention. There is a small percentage that it's going to take something else, and it's heartbreaking, but under these circumstances, the odds are certainly in our favor of getting that person the help that they need. So my job is to continue then to support the family in maintaining those healthy boundaries. So what are the benefits? Number one, the obvious. The loved one accepts the gift of life, which is treatment. But eating disorders breed chaos. Families are torn apart by these. It's not just the individual. The intervention process brings divided families together to create a united and unifying team. Truly, the conflict with that family can be eliminated or significantly reduced if they'll come together and stay united. So it's really more than just that individual. I believe this firmly. An intervention is always successful if the afflicted individual goes to treatment and the family continues to get help for themselves. While their loved one is in treatment, the family needs to do some work. They may need to see a therapist. They may need to participate in a 12-step program. They need to do some work as well, so that when their loved one comes home, they're not coming home to the exact same situation and scenario. It's about family recovery. Let me conclude with a little story. Once upon a time, I was called in to do an intervention for a young woman with an eating disorder. And what had happened was the family had just kind of ignored it and denied it for years and years and years until this woman had a daughter. And when this daughter was, as I recall, about 7 years old, the mother began to restrict the food intake for the daughter. And the family realized this is way, way out of control. So they called me in. We did a lot of work in advance by phone and email. I flew into their town on a Friday night. We spent all day together on Saturday doing the training, doing the preparation. We met again Sunday morning to do the rehearsal. And then Sunday afternoon, she had been invited over to her parents' home. She arrived, and there we were. We were ready to present this offer for treatment. And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, but as you may imagine, she didn't think she needed help. So as the family dynamics began to shift and she could no longer pick them apart, she could no longer divide and conquer, the family unit came together. She recognized, okay, I'm going to have to accept some help. So the same day we were on a plane, we flew to another state. She engaged in a treatment program. She was there, as I recall, about 75 days. And I'm delighted to report that the last time I talked to the family, not only is she doing well, but the family is doing well also. In fact, this is one of those rare occasions where the individual called me later and said thank you. As you can imagine, I'm not the most popular guy the day of the intervention, but when they get well, as they recover, they are able to embrace recovery and things really do change. Here's a few references for some materials that you may want to look at to further study this, or how you might contact me. I'd be happy to discuss the services that we provide. I'd be happy to answer questions. There's no obligation whatsoever. So give me a call, shoot me an email. I would be absolutely delighted. My phone number, 480-213-4950. Thank you again for the opportunity to spend some time with you today, and I hope this has been helpful for you.
Thank you, Jerry. And real quick before we end, we did have a few questions.
Sure.
One is, are there any just real practical tips for recognizing the stages of change and readiness for treatment?
Absolutely. If you've got a loved one that is caught up in this disorder, and you're recognizing some of the telltale signs, the restricting, the binging, the purging, the compulsive exercise, the physiological changes, and you go to your loved one and express that you're concerned and they are in total denial, you've probably got a pre-contemplator on your hands, perhaps contemplator. And so to try at that point to confront them boldly and courageously probably isn't going to work. Rather, it is time to pull together and get the training and the education that you need to help that individual recognize that they too need to work their way through these stages of change. If, on the other hand, you approach them and they say, well, why didn't you come to me sooner? Let's go. Well, they're in the action stage. You certainly don't need me. Now it's time to get them some help.
Excellent. Thank you. Great answer. And then the last question was, what about when there's been a negative intervention experience beforehand? Is it possible to try it again?
It is. I've done several just like that the first intervention wasn't handled well. The person became very angry. That is why I spend the amount of time on the front end with the family, so that when we do meet with their loved one, we can help them understand we're not here to judge, we're not here to criticize, we are not here to beat you up. We're here because we love you and we want to support wellness and recovery. So that preparation on the front end is absolutely crucial. We don't just show up and, well, let's try it again. That approach doesn't work.
That makes sense. Jerry, this was an outstanding presentation. I learned so much, and I know the audience will have some additional questions that we weren't able to address yet, and I will forward those to you.
Fabulous.
And I also want to remind our attendees to take a look at the wonderful 4 handouts that Jerry provided. You'll see these in the lower section of your screen in the right-hand corner. And these are useful to better understand intervention and also more about Jerry and how to reach him. Thank you for your time, Jerry.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jacqueline. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, Jerry.